If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. Sharing it with your friends and family helps spread knowledge, and when we help others grow, we grow too. Thank you so much for listening. Let's dive into the podcast. Chapter 1, Dawn in the Land Between Rivers. Part 1, the Ubaid and Uruk Foundations. Settling the Fertile Crescent around 6500 BCE, groups of wandering families began arriving in the marshy lowlands, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers meet the sea. These early settlers had spent generations moving across the highlands, following herds and seasonal rains. But something about this flat, muddy region made them pause. The two great rivers carried rich soil from distant mountains, leaving behind dark earth that seemed to promise abundance. The newcomers faced a harsh reality. The rivers flooded without warning, drowning crops one season and disappearing entirely the next. Wild animals prowled the reed beds, and summer heat made work nearly impossible. Yet these determined people saw opportunity where others might see only danger. They began the slow work of taming this wild land. The breakthrough came when someone realized they could control the water instead of simply enduring it. Using nothing but stone tools and baskets, families began digging channels to guide floodwater away from their homes and toward their fields. They built small dams from mud and reeds, creating pools that stored water for dry months. These simple innovations transformed everything. Villages appeared where only camps had existed before. At Eridu, families built the first permanent houses from sun-dried mud bricks. They learned to make pottery that could store grain and water for months. Their tools became more sophisticated as craftsmen specialized in working stone, wood, and metal. Women developed new ways to grind grain and preserve food, while men perfected techniques for managing livestock and directing water flow. The Ubaid people, as we now call them, discovered that settled life brought unexpected advantages. Children could learn complex skills from their parents instead of focusing solely on survival. Some individuals became experts in pottery, others in tool-making or animal care. This specialization meant better products and more efficient work, which led to surplus food and goods. As villages grew larger, social structures became more complex. Leaders emerged to coordinate irrigation projects and settle disputes. Religious practices centered around ensuring good harvests and favorable floods. The most successful settlements, like early Uruk, began attracting people from surrounding areas who wanted to share in the prosperity. By 4000 BCE, these river communities had created something entirely new in human history. They had permanent towns with sophisticated water management systems, specialized craftspeople, and organized leadership. The foundation was set for the next great leap, the emergence of true cities that would reshape human civilization forever. The stage was now prepared for the rise of the world's first urban centers, where thousands would gather and create entirely new ways of living together. Part 2. The Rise of Cities. Eridu, Uruk, and the Sumerian identity emerges. By 3800 BCE, something remarkable was happening along the rivers of southern Mesopotamia. The successful farming villages that had dotted the landscape were growing larger, drawing people from miles around. What started as clusters of mud brick houses began transforming into something the world had never seen before: true cities. Eridu stood as the first great example of this transformation. Local stories claimed it was the oldest city on Earth, blessed by the water god Enki himself. Archaeological evidence supports its ancient importance. The settlement grew around a magnificent temple that was rebuilt and expanded over centuries, each new version grander than the last. People came to Eridu not just to farm, but to worship, trade, and learn specialized crafts. The city became a magnet for talent and ambition. Uruk followed a similar path but grew even larger. By 3500 BCE, it housed nearly 40,000 people within its walls, making it humanity's first true metropolis. Walking through Uruk's streets, visitors would encounter potters, metalworkers, weavers, and priests living side by side. Each neighborhood had its own character, but all were connected by shared rituals and beliefs that bound the community together. These early cities required careful planning. Engineers designed sophisticated drainage systems to handle waste and prevent flooding. Architects laid out streets in logical patterns, with wide boulevards leading to temple complexes at the city centers. Storage buildings held grain reserves that could feed thousands during lean times. The scale of organization was unprecedented in human history. The concentration of diverse peoples in these urban centers sparked cultural innovation. Farmers from different regions brought varied crop techniques. Artisans shared metalworking secrets. Traders introduced exotic materials from distant lands. This mixing pot effect created distinctly Sumerian art styles, religious practices, and social customs that spread throughout the region. Religious festivals became powerful unifying forces. During major celebrations, entire cities would participate in elaborate processions honoring their patron deities. These events reinforced shared identity while showcasing the community's prosperity and power. The great temples served as both spiritual centers and practical meeting places where important decisions were made. Trade networks expanded rapidly as cities competed for resources and markets. Merchants traveled hundreds of miles to obtain timber, metals, and precious stones unavailable locally. These commercial relationships created wealth, but also fostered exchange of ideas and technologies that accelerated cultural development. The success of cities like Eridu and Uruk inspired imitators throughout Mesopotamia. Soon, dozens of urban centers dotted the landscape, each developing its own character while sharing the basic Sumerian model of city life. This urban revolution created new possibilities for human achievement, but it also generated unprecedented challenges that would demand innovative solutions. Part 3. Gods, Temples, and Kings. The Foundations of Power. The growing cities faced problems that demanded new solutions. As populations swelled and trade expanded, local leaders struggled to maintain order and coordinate complex activities. Who would organize the massive irrigation projects that kept crops alive? Who would settle disputes between merchants? Who would ensure that everyone contributed fairly to community projects? The answer emerged from an unexpected source: the temples. Every Sumerian city had grown around a sacred shrine dedicated to a patron god or goddess. These temples weren't just places of worship. They owned vast amounts of land, stored grain and goods, and employed hundreds of workers. The priests who ran these temples gradually became the most powerful people in their communities. These religious leaders possessed something crucial that other influential figures lacked: divine approval. When a priest claimed that the gods had chosen him to lead, people listened. This divine connection gave priests authority over both spiritual and earthly matters. They could command respect when organizing work gangs to dig canals or build walls. They could settle arguments by claiming to speak for the gods. They could collect taxes by declaring them religious obligations. The most successful priest kings built monuments that demonstrated their power for all to see. Massive stepped towers called ziggurats rose from the centers of cities, their mud brick walls reaching toward the heavens. These weren't just impressive buildings. They served as the headquarters for running entire city-states. From these towering structures, priest kings coordinated farming schedules, managed trade expeditions, and stored the wealth that flowed into their cities. Inside the ziggurats, teams of administrators worked to keep track of countless details. They recorded which fields produced the most grain, which workers deserved extra rations, and which foreign merchants could be trusted. They organized the seasonal festivals that brought communities together and reminded everyone of their shared beliefs. They planned the construction projects that required thousands of workers moving in perfect coordination. The priest kings developed elaborate ceremonies to reinforce their authority. They wore special clothing, performed sacred rituals, and lived in luxury that set them apart from ordinary citizens. When they appeared in public, it was as representatives of the gods themselves. This divine theater convinced people that obeying their earthly rulers was the same as serving the gods. This system worked because it solved real problems. Cities needed leadership to function, and the priest kings provided it. They created order from chaos, organized massive public works, and gave people a sense of purpose and identity. However, their growing power also created new challenges. As priest kings accumulated wealth and authority, they needed better ways to keep track of their vast holdings and complex operations. The success of these early rulers set the stage for an innovation that would change human history forever: the development of writing systems to manage their increasingly sophisticated civilizations. Part 4. The Taming of Water. Irrigation, Agriculture, and Trade Networks. The priests and kings had built impressive cities and temples, but their greatest challenge lay outside the city walls. The rivers that gave life to Mesopotamia were wild and unpredictable. The Tigris and Euphrates flooded without warning, sometimes washing away entire settlements. Other times they retreated so far that crops withered in the scorching sun. The Sumerians realized that to truly control their destiny, they had to tame these mighty waters. The solution came through remarkable ingenuity. Teams of workers, organized by the priest kings, began digging channels to redirect river water where it was needed most. These canals stretched for miles across the flat landscape, carrying precious water to fields that had never known reliable moisture. They built earthen walls called levees along the riverbanks to control flooding. When the rivers rose, the water stayed within these boundaries, instead of spreading chaos across the land. But the Sumerians went further. They constructed reservoirs to store water during abundant times, creating insurance against drought. These weren't simple holes in the ground. They were carefully engineered basins lined with clay and fitted with gates that could open and close as needed. Workers called canal inspectors walked the waterways daily, checking for damage and clearing blockages. The results transformed everything. Fields that once produced meager harvests now yielded grain in abundance. Barley and wheat grew thick and tall. Date palms heavy with fruit lined the waterways. Vegetables flourished in gardens that had reliable irrigation. The land could now feed far more people than ever before. This agricultural revolution created something remarkable: surplus. For the first time, not everyone needed to work in the fields. Some people could become full-time craftsmen, creating pottery, tools, and jewelry. Others became merchants, traders, or builders. The priest kings no longer had to worry only about survival. They could plan, expand, and dream. The surplus grain became a form of wealth that could be traded. Sumerian merchants loaded boats with barley and sailed to distant lands, returning with timber from mountain forests, precious stones from far-off hills, and metals that didn't exist in their homeland. Trade routes spread like spiderwebs across the ancient world, connecting Sumer to places hundreds of miles away. This new prosperity brought new problems. Managing the irrigation systems required constant coordination between cities. Who would maintain which section of canal? How would water rights be divided during dry years? The growing trade networks needed reliable ways to track goods, debts, and agreements. Merchants had to remember complex deals made with people they might not see for months. The priest kings found themselves managing not just temples and local affairs, but vast economic networks that stretched across the known world. They needed better tools than memory and simple tokens to handle this complexity. The success of their irrigation systems had created a civilization so sophisticated that it was pushing beyond the limits of what could be managed through spoken words alone. Part 5. Seeds of Complexity. The Pressures of Urban Growth. The great cities of Sumer had grown beyond what anyone could have imagined. What started as small farming settlements along the rivers had exploded into bustling centers where tens of thousands of people lived, worked, and struggled together. The narrow streets of Uruk and Eridu buzzed with constant activity as farmers, potters, metalworkers, and merchants pushed past each other in the crowded marketplaces. The smell of bread, sweat, and animal waste mixed in the hot air while children darted between the legs of adults carrying heavy loads. This rapid growth brought problems no one had faced before. The old ways of doing things simply could not handle so many people living so close together. Food had to be brought in from distant farms, distributed fairly, and stored safely. Water from the canals needed careful rationing, especially during the dry months, when every drop mattered. Waste from thousands of families had to go somewhere, and diseases spread quickly through the packed neighborhoods. The people themselves were changing too. No longer were they all farmers who knew each other from childhood. Now there were clear divisions between those who had much and those who had little. At the top sat the wealthy families who controlled the best land and the biggest trade deals. They lived in large houses with courtyards and owned slaves to do their work. Below them were skilled craftsmen who made beautiful pottery, sharp tools, and intricate jewelry. These artisans took pride in their work, but depended on the wealthy for their living. Merchants formed another group, always traveling between cities with their caravans of goods. They knew the latest news from distant places and spoke multiple languages, making them valuable, but also foreign to many locals. At the bottom were the common laborers who dug canals, built walls, and carried heavy loads. They worked hard but owned almost nothing, living in small mud brick houses that barely kept out the rain. These different groups did not always get along. The wealthy wanted to protect their property and keep taxes low. The craftsmen wanted fair prices for their goods and steady work. The laborers wanted better food and living conditions. When disagreements arose, who would settle them? The old village councils could not handle such complex disputes between strangers. The city-states themselves competed fiercely with each other. Ur might dam a river to water its fields, leaving Uruk with less water downstream. Trade routes that made one city rich could bankrupt its neighbors. Young men from different cities sometimes fought over the same grazing lands or fishing spots. These conflicts required careful diplomacy and sometimes military action. The priest-kings found themselves drowning in details they had never had to manage before. They needed to track which families owed grain to the temple, which merchants had permission to trade in the city, and which workers were assigned to dig new canals. Memory alone could not hold all this information, and simple clay tokens were becoming inadequate for such complex record-keeping. Something new was desperately needed, a better way to capture, store, and share the growing flood of information that kept these great cities running. Chapter 2. The Turning Point. Necessity Breeds Invention. Part 1. The Problem of Memory, Clay Tokens, and Early Accounting. The bustling cities of ancient Sumer faced a growing crisis that would have seemed familiar to any modern business owner. As settlements like Ur and Uruk expanded into thriving centers of trade and government, their administrators confronted an overwhelming challenge: how to keep track of everything. Grain stores, livestock counts, textile shipments, and tribute payments from distant villages created a mountain of information that no human mind could reliably hold. Picture a temple administrator in 3500 BCE, tasked with managing hundreds of sheep, thousands of barley measures, and dozens of workers' rations. Every day brought new transactions. Farmers delivered grain, herders brought animals, craftsmen received raw materials and delivered finished goods. Workers needed their daily bread. The sheer volume of details threatened to drown the most capable minds in confusion. Human memory, no matter how trained, proved inadequate for this task. Oral tradition worked well for passing down stories and customs, but it failed miserably when precise numbers mattered. Was it 47 sheep or 74? Did the temple receive 200 jars of oil last month or 300? These questions demanded exact answers, not approximate memories. The Sumerians' solution was brilliantly simple: small clay tokens. These thumb-sized objects came in various shapes, each representing something specific. A cone meant a measure of grain. A sphere represented a bushel of barley. A cylinder stood for an animal. Different sizes indicated different quantities. Instead of trusting memory, administrators could physically count out tokens matching their actual goods. Archaeological discoveries have revealed thousands of these tokens scattered across ancient Mesopotamia. Each tells a story of careful record-keeping. The tokens weren't random. They followed standardized shapes and sizes that administrators across different cities could recognize. This consistency suggests a sophisticated understanding of the need for universal systems. But tokens created their own problems. How could you send a record to someone without losing track of what you had counted? The Sumerians solved this with clay envelopes called bullae. They sealed tokens inside hollow clay balls, then marked the outside to show what lay within. The recipient could break open the envelope to verify the contents matched the external markings. These humble clay objects represented something revolutionary: the first attempt to store information outside human memory. For the first time in history, knowledge could exist independently of the person who created it. A count made today could be verified tomorrow, next month, or next year. Numbers became permanent. The implications stretched far beyond simple bookkeeping. These tokens required abstract thinking about representation. A clay cone wasn't grain itself, but stood for grain. This mental leap from concrete object to symbolic representation laid the foundation for all future writing systems. As Sumerian cities continued growing, even this token system would prove insufficient for their expanding needs. The stage was set for an even more dramatic breakthrough in how humans would preserve and share information. Part 2. From Mark to Meaning. The birth of pictographs. Around 3300 BCE, Sumerian administrators faced a moment that would change human history forever. The token system that had served their growing cities was reaching its limits. Temples and palaces overflowed with clay envelopes containing hundreds of tokens. Checking the contents meant breaking the seals, destroying the very record they needed to preserve. Something had to change. The breakthrough came when a clever administrator made a simple observation. Instead of sealing tokens inside clay envelopes, why not press the tokens into the soft clay surface before sealing? This way, anyone could see what was inside without breaking the container. The impressions left clear marks: circles for sheep, triangles for grain, lines for numbers. These pressed marks worked so well that scribes began questioning whether they needed the actual tokens at all. Why carry around heavy clay objects when the marks themselves told the whole story? The leap from three-dimensional token to two-dimensional symbol happened gradually, but its impact was revolutionary. For the first time, information existed purely as marks on a surface. The early symbols looked like the objects they represented. A drawing of a bull's head meant cattle. A picture of grain stalks represented barley. Numbers appeared as repeated strokes or circles. These pictographs were crude but unmistakable. Anyone looking at the tablet could understand the basic meaning, even if they had never seen that particular scribe's work before. As word spread through Sumerian cities, different scribes began creating similar symbols for the same objects. Trade between cities required standardization. A sheep symbol in Ur needed to mean the same thing in Uruk. Gradually, certain forms became accepted across the region. The wild bull's head simplified into a few essential lines. Complex grain drawings reduced to basic geometric shapes. The real magic happened when scribes realized these symbols could represent more than just physical objects. The picture of a foot could mean foot, but also walking or going. A star symbol could represent the actual star, the concept of divinity, or even the passage of time. Abstract ideas that had never been captured before suddenly became permanent. Temple administrators discovered they could record prayers and rituals. Palace officials documented laws and royal decrees. Merchants tracked not just quantities, but also agreements and contracts. The clay tablets multiplied rapidly, creating the world's first libraries and archives. What started as a practical solution to counting sheep had become something far more powerful. These marks on clay could capture human thoughts, preserve them across time, and share them across distances. Knowledge no longer died with its creator. Stories, laws, and wisdom could pass from generation to generation without distortion. The Sumerians had created the foundation for all future writing systems. Their breakthrough would soon evolve into something even more sophisticated, as the simple pictographs transformed into the wedge-shaped marks we now call cuneiform. Part 3. Inventing Writing. Cuneiform shaped from clay and reed. Around 3200 BCE, something remarkable happened in the workshops and temples of ancient Sumer. The scribes who had been carefully drawing pictographs on clay tablets began to change their approach. Instead of trying to create perfect pictures of objects, they started pressing triangular reeds into the soft clay at different angles. What emerged were wedge-shaped marks that could be made quickly and consistently. This shift happened because speed mattered. As Sumerian cities grew larger and more complex, administrators needed to process information faster than ever before. Drawing detailed pictures of grain stalks or water jugs took precious time, but pressing a reed stylus into clay could create the same meaning with just a few quick strokes. The wedge shapes were easier to make and could be repeated by different scribes with remarkable consistency. The scribes discovered something extraordinary as they worked with these wedge marks. They could combine the symbols in new ways to represent ideas that had no physical form. A symbol for mouth, placed next to one for water, could mean to drink. Two symbols for man might indicate a gathering or discussion. The writing system was learning to capture abstract thoughts, not just count physical objects. Clay tablets began filling with documents that would have been impossible to create with simple pictographs. Merchants recorded complex business agreements that outlined payment schedules and delivery terms. Temple priests wrote down prayers and ritual instructions with precise detail. Government officials documented laws that covered everything from property disputes to marriage contracts. The variety was astounding. Each tablet told a story of human interaction frozen in time. A merchant named Enlil Bani might press his cylinder seal into clay to guarantee a shipment of barley would arrive before the next moon. A temple administrator could record exactly how many sheep were sacrificed during the spring festival. A judge could preserve the details of a land dispute so future generations would remember the decision. The scribes working in temple schools and palace workshops had created something that would outlast kingdoms and empires. Their wedge-shaped marks could preserve human thoughts with precision that spoken words could never match. A contract written in cuneiform would say exactly the same thing whether read today or in 1,000 years. This breakthrough marked the moment when information became truly permanent. Knowledge could now travel across vast distances and survive the death of its creator. The Sumerians had given humanity its first reliable method for preserving complex ideas, creating a foundation that would support every civilization that followed. The clay tablets multiplying in Sumerian archives represented more than administrative convenience. They marked humanity's first victory over forgetting, establishing writing as the most powerful tool for human progress ever invented. Part 4. Scribes and Specialists, the Guardians of Knowledge. The clay tablets covered with wedge-shaped marks now filled entire rooms in Sumerian temples and palaces. But who could read these mysterious symbols? As writing became essential to running the city-states, a new group of people emerged to master this complex skill. These were the scribes, and they would become some of the most important people in Sumerian society. Learning to write cuneiform was not easy. Boys, mostly from wealthy families, began their education at age 7 in temple schools called adubas. They spent years memorizing hundreds of signs, each one representing different sounds, words, or ideas. Students practiced by copying the same symbols over and over on clay tablets, their fingers cramping as they pressed the reed stylus into the soft surface. Teachers were strict, often beating students who made mistakes or fell behind. The education took over a decade to complete. Students learned mathematics, literature, and law alongside their writing skills. They memorized long lists of words and practiced writing letters, contracts, and religious texts. Only a small number of boys could afford this lengthy education, making literacy a privilege of the wealthy. Women rarely learned to write, though some priestesses received basic training. Once trained, scribes held tremendous power in Sumerian society. They ranked just below priests and nobles in importance. Kings depended on them to run their governments, keeping track of taxes, recording laws, and managing trade agreements. Temple administrators needed scribes to record offerings, schedule festivals, and maintain property records. Merchants relied on them to write contracts and track business deals across long distances. Scribes worked in different settings throughout the city-states. In temples, they recorded religious ceremonies and managed vast estates. In palaces, they served as royal secretaries, drafting letters to other rulers and documenting court proceedings. In marketplaces, they wrote contracts for ordinary people who could not read or write themselves. Some scribes specialized in specific areas, becoming experts in law, medicine, or astronomy. The ability to read and write created a new kind of power. Information became currency, and those who controlled it gained influence over others. Scribes often knew secrets about trade deals, legal disputes, and government policies. This knowledge made them valuable advisors to rulers and wealthy merchants. They formed professional groups, protecting their skills and passing down techniques through generations. Writing changed how knowledge moved through Sumerian society. Before scribes, information depended on human memory and word of mouth. Stories, laws, and technical knowledge could be lost when people died or forgotten when details changed through retelling. Scribes made knowledge permanent and exact. They created libraries of clay tablets that preserved everything from mathematical formulas to epic poems. The scribal schools became centers of learning and culture. Students copied great works of literature, ensuring these stories survived for future generations. They documented religious beliefs, scientific observations, and historical events. This systematic preservation of knowledge allowed Sumerian civilization to build upon its past achievements rather than constantly starting over. As literacy spread among the elite, it transformed how power worked in the city-states. Written laws replaced oral traditions, making justice more consistent but also more rigid. Royal decrees could now reach distant provinces with exact wording. Treaties between cities became more detailed and binding. The scribes had created a new foundation for organized society, one built on permanent records rather than fleeting memory. Part 5. From Practicality to Permanence. The First Written Laws and Myths. With writing firmly established in the hands of skilled scribes, Sumerian society began to realize the true power of permanent records. What started as simple lists of grain and livestock soon transformed into something far more profound. The kings and priests of the city-states discovered that writing could capture not just numbers, but complex ideas, stories, and commands that would outlast any human memory. King Ur-Nammu of Ur understood this potential better than most. Around 2100 BCE, he ordered his scribes to create something revolutionary, a comprehensive legal code carved in stone and written on clay tablets. This wasn't just a collection of random rules. It was a systematic attempt to define justice for an entire kingdom. The code covered everything from marriage disputes to property theft, establishing fixed punishments that applied to all citizens equally. These written laws changed everything about how justice worked. Before, disputes were settled by local elders or priests who relied on tradition and personal judgment. Now, judges could consult written standards. A merchant accused of cheating could point to the exact law that defined fair trading. A farmer could prove his land ownership with written documents that referenced the legal code. The arbitrary nature of oral justice gave way to predictable, documented procedures. But the scribes didn't stop with laws. They began recording the sacred stories that defined Sumerian identity. The Epic of Gilgamesh, tales of Inanna's descent to the underworld, and creation myths that explained how the gods shaped humanity from clay, all these stories found permanent form in cuneiform script. Temple priests collaborated with scribes to preserve religious hymns and rituals, ensuring that future generations would worship correctly. Royal scribes also documented the achievements of their kings. They recorded military victories, building projects, and diplomatic agreements with neighboring cities. These royal inscriptions served multiple purposes. They honored the gods, impressed foreign visitors, and created lasting monuments to royal power. When King Gudea of Lagash built temples, his scribes carved detailed accounts of the construction, including dreams and divine messages that guided the work. The preservation of collective memory through writing gave Sumerians something unprecedented: a sense of continuous history. Priests could read stories written centuries earlier. Kings could reference laws established by their predecessors. Young scribes learned not just how to write, but what their ancestors had thought, believed, and accomplished. This documentary culture created new forms of authority. Written royal decrees carried more weight than spoken commands because they couldn't be forgotten or misremembered. Temple records proved which offerings were owed to the gods. Property documents settled disputes that might have festered for generations without written proof. As writing matured from practical tool to cultural foundation, it fundamentally altered Sumerian civilization. The same technology that had tracked barley shipments now preserved the wisdom of kings, the stories of gods, and the accumulated knowledge of an entire people for generations yet to come. Chapter 3. Words of Power. Writing Reshapes Civilization. Part 1. Writing Spreads, Administration, Bureaucracy, and Empire Building. Once writing moved beyond simple trade records, Sumerian rulers discovered they held something far more powerful than anyone had imagined. The same clay tablets that tracked barley and sheep could track people, land, and loyalty itself. What began as a merchant's tool became the foundation of organized government. The transformation happened gradually but completely changed how cities operated. Before writing, a ruler relied on memory and trusted messengers to manage his domain. Tax collectors worked from what they remembered. Officials made decisions based on spoken agreements that could be disputed or forgotten. But with cuneiform tablets, everything could be recorded, verified, and stored. Sumerian administrators quickly realized they could create permanent records of who owned what land, who owed which taxes, and who held what position in the government. Clay tablets became filing systems that never forgot. A farmer's tax obligation, written in cuneiform, remained the same whether the tax collector was honest or corrupt. Property boundaries, once marked only by stones or memory, could now be documented with precise measurements and witness accounts. The city-state of Ur developed one of the most sophisticated record-keeping systems of the ancient world. Scribes created detailed inventories of everything from temple offerings to military equipment. They tracked the movement of goods through different districts, recorded the names and duties of government workers, and maintained lists of citizens and their obligations to the state. This bureaucratic revolution allowed Sumerian cities to grow larger and more complex than ever before. A ruler could now manage thousands of people across multiple settlements because his written orders could travel anywhere and remain unchanged. Tax systems became more efficient and fair because every payment was recorded. Courts could reference previous cases and established laws rather than relying solely on a judge's memory or personal judgment. Writing also became a tool of legitimacy and power projection. Rulers commissioned scribes to create official accounts of their achievements, their divine appointments, and their legal authority. These texts served as permanent declarations that could outlast any individual ruler's lifetime. When Sargon of Akkad conquered Sumerian cities, he used their own writing system to document his victories and justify his rule to the conquered populations. Rival city-states competed not just with armies but with administrative efficiency. The state that could best organize its resources, maintain accurate records, and coordinate complex operations held decisive advantages. Writing enabled them to plan military campaigns, manage supply lines, and govern conquered territories with unprecedented precision. The scribal class emerged as essential government officials, their literacy making them indispensable to rulers who themselves often could not read or write. These educated administrators became the backbone of Sumerian governance, creating standardized procedures and institutional memory that survived individual leaders. Through writing, the Sumerians had created something entirely new, government that could function through systems rather than personalities alone. This administrative foundation would soon support not just individual cities, but vast empires that stretched across the known world. Part 2. Literature and Legacy. Epic of Gilgamesh and the Sumerian King List. As Sumerian bureaucrats mastered the art of record-keeping and administration, their scribes began to venture beyond the practical realm of taxes and trade. The same clay tablets that track grain shipments and property disputes would soon carry something far more enduring: the first great works of literature in human history. Around 2100 BCE, an anonymous scribe pressed stylus to clay and began immortalizing the adventures of Gilgamesh, the legendary king of Uruk. This was no mere administrative record. The Epic of Gilgamesh told of a powerful ruler who journeyed to the ends of the earth seeking immortality, faced monsters, befriended a wild man named Enkidu, and ultimately learned to accept human mortality. The story blended historical memory of a real king with mythological adventures, creating something entirely new, literature that explored what it meant to be human. The scribes crafted these tales with careful attention to both entertainment and instruction. Gilgamesh's journey from arrogant tyrant to wise ruler provided moral lessons about leadership and humility. His friendship with Enkidu demonstrated the civilizing power of human connection. Most powerfully, his failed quest for eternal life taught that mortals must find meaning within the boundaries of death, a revolutionary idea for people who had always looked to their gods for answers about existence. Alongside these epic tales, Sumerian scribes compiled the King List, a chronicle that claimed to record every ruler from the dawn of time. This remarkable document mixed historical facts with fantastic claims, describing kings who supposedly ruled for thousands of years before the Great Flood. The list served multiple purposes. It legitimized current rulers by connecting them to ancient dynasties, preserved historical memory, and established the divine origin of kingship itself. These texts became cultural treasures that defined Sumerian identity. Young scribes copied them generation after generation, ensuring their survival while subtly adapting them for new audiences. The stories spread throughout Mesopotamia as the Sumerian writing system traveled to other cities and cultures. Each retelling reinforced shared values about heroism, mortality, friendship, and the proper relationship between humans and gods. The impact reached far beyond Sumer's borders. Later civilizations, Babylonians, Assyrians, and even the ancient Greeks would draw inspiration from these early masterpieces. Elements of Gilgamesh's story appeared in the Bible's account of Noah, while the hero's journey structure influenced countless later tales. The King List established patterns for historical writing that would shape how civilizations recorded their past for millennia. Through literature, the Sumerians had transformed writing from a mere tool into something sacred. Their scribes had become storytellers, their clay tablets repositories of wisdom that spoke to the deepest human concerns. This literary revolution would soon merge with another profound development as writing began to bridge the gap between mortal concerns and divine mysteries. Part 3. Faith and Ritual on Clay, Recording the Sacred and the Everyday. The sacred and the mundane flowed together on Sumerian clay tablets, creating an extraordinary record of how writing transformed both worship and daily life. Inside the great temple complexes of Uruk, and Babylon, scribes hunched over their work tables, carefully pressing wedge marks that would preserve everything from ancient hymns to grocery lists. The temples had become more than places of worship. They served as the world's first libraries, schools, and administrative centers all rolled into one. Young boys arrived each morning to learn the sacred art of writing, spending years mastering the hundreds of cuneiform signs. Their teachers, the priest scribes, held enormous power as the only people who could read and write in most communities. These scribes recorded prayers that ordinary people could never memorize, preserving the exact words needed to please the gods. They wrote down hymns praising Inanna, goddess of love and war, and Enlil, lord of the winds. Each syllable mattered. One wrong word might anger a deity, so scribes checked and rechecked their sacred texts. They also created detailed instructions for rituals, explaining precisely how to sacrifice a sheep or perform a marriage ceremony. But writing captured far more than religious ceremonies. Temple scribes kept meticulous records of daily business. They noted how much barley the temple received, who owed taxes, and which workers deserved payment. A typical tablet might record that farmer Enlil Bani delivered 30 bushels of grain on the third day of the month, while another documented the purchase of 2 sheep for an upcoming festival. Personal letters reveal intimate glimpses of Sumerian life. Merchants wrote to their wives about business trips. Parents scolded children who had misbehaved. Young scribes complained to their teachers about difficult assignments. These tablets show that writing had moved beyond the temple walls, becoming part of ordinary people's lives. The scribes also recorded omens and predictions. They believed the gods spoke through unusual events, a 2-headed calf, strange cloud formations, or the flight patterns of birds. Teams of priests carefully observed these signs and wrote down their meanings. These omen texts became vast reference books that future generations would consult when facing important decisions. Temple archives grew enormous over time. Thousands of tablets filled storage rooms, creating humanity's first great collections of written knowledge. Scribes developed cataloging systems to track their holdings, creating the world's earliest library science. This explosion of written material changed how people thought about memory and knowledge. Information no longer lived only in human minds. It could be stored, retrieved, and shared across generations. Writing had become the bridge between human concerns and divine will, preserving both sacred wisdom and everyday experiences on clay that would last for millennia. As these temple archives expanded, Sumerian city-states began to look beyond their borders, using their mastery of written communication to forge new relationships with distant neighbors. Part 4. Diplomacy and War, Treaties, Alliances, and the Record of Conflict. The clay tablets that once held temple records and royal inventories now carried messages across hostile borders. As Sumerian city-states grew in power and ambition, their scribes faced a new challenge: How to communicate with enemies and allies who spoke different languages and worshiped different gods. King Eonatum of Lagash discovered the power of written diplomacy when border disputes with neighboring Umma threatened to drain his treasury through endless warfare. Instead of relying solely on messengers who might forget crucial details or die en route, he began inscribing formal agreements on stone monuments. These early treaties spelled out exact boundary lines, tribute payments, and consequences for breaking the peace. When Umma's ruler violated their agreement, Eonatum could point to the carved words as proof of betrayal. The practice spread rapidly among Mesopotamian rulers. Written treaties offered something verbal agreements never could: permanence and precision. No longer could a defeated king claim he had agreed to different terms, or that his messenger had been misunderstood. The clay and stone held the exact words, witnessed by the gods whose names were invoked in the text. Diplomatic correspondence flourished as scribes developed standard formulas for international communication. Letters between rulers began with elaborate greetings that acknowledged the recipient's divine mandate while asserting the sender's own legitimacy. These diplomatic scripts became so refined that modern scholars can identify which city-state wrote a letter simply by analyzing its greeting formulas. War itself transformed under the influence of writing. Sumerian generals began keeping detailed campaign records, documenting troop movements, supply lists, and battle outcomes. These military chronicles served multiple purposes. They helped plan future campaigns, justified enormous military expenses to the population, and most importantly, preserved the memory of victory for eternity. The famous Stele of Vultures, erected by Eonatum, exemplifies this new approach to warfare documentation. The monument combines vivid battle scenes with written accounts of the conflict, creating a permanent record that would outlast any human memory. Future generations could read exactly how their ancestors had triumphed over their enemies. Written declarations of war became formal diplomatic tools. Rather than simply attacking, rulers now sent clay tablets announcing their intentions and justifying their actions to both enemies and potential allies. These declarations often listed grievances in methodical detail, creating legal frameworks for conflict that had never existed before. The most revolutionary development came when scribes began creating copies of important treaties and storing them in multiple locations. This redundancy meant that destroying one copy could not erase an agreement entirely. City-states developed the practice of sending treaty copies to neutral parties for safekeeping, creating early forms of international law enforcement. As these written diplomatic practices matured, they created new expectations for how civilized peoples should conduct relations with one another. The age of pure might makes right was ending, replaced by a world where written agreements carried divine authority and legal weight. These precedents would echo through history, establishing patterns of international law that persist today. This mastery of written diplomacy and warfare documentation positioned the Sumerians as the dominant force in Mesopotamia, but it also attracted attention from ambitious neighbors who wanted to harness this powerful technology for themselves. Part 5. Challenges of change, language evolution, and influence. Success often brings unexpected challenges. As Sumerian cities grew more powerful and prosperous through their mastery of writing, people from distant lands began arriving in Mesopotamia. Among these newcomers were the Akkadians, who spoke a completely different language. The Sumerians used words like Dingir for god and Lugal for king, while the Akkadians had their own terms like Ilu and Sharu. This created a fascinating problem. How could two peoples share the same writing system when they spoke entirely different languages? The Akkadians proved remarkably clever in solving this puzzle. They discovered that cuneiform symbols could work for their language too, but in unexpected ways. While Sumerians had used one symbol to represent both a word and its sound, the Akkadians focused more on the sounds. They took the Sumerian symbol for water, which sounded like and used it whenever they needed that sound in their own words, regardless of meaning. This transformation turned cuneiform from a primarily Sumerian tool into something far more flexible and powerful. This linguistic mixing created both opportunities and tensions. Sumerian scribes suddenly found themselves working alongside Akkadian apprentices in temple schools. Young Akkadians learned to write Sumerian religious texts while also adapting the script for their own literature and laws. The result was a rich blend of cultures, but also growing competition. Some Sumerian priests worried that their sacred language would lose its purity, while ambitious Akkadian nobles saw writing as their path to political power. The changes went beyond simple translation. As more languages adopted cuneiform, the script itself began evolving. Scribes developed shortcuts and new symbol combinations to handle sounds that hadn't existed in original Sumerian. What started as careful pictographs became increasingly abstract wedge patterns. A single symbol might now carry multiple meanings depending on which language context surrounded it. These developments created unexpected social shifts. Bilingual scribes became valuable diplomatic assets, able to communicate with both Sumerian and Akkadian leaders. Mixed marriages between Sumerian and Akkadian families became more common, especially among merchant and administrative classes. Children from these unions often grew up speaking both languages and thinking in new ways about culture and identity. The tension reached deeper than language alone. When Akkadian scribes began recording their own versions of ancient stories, they sometimes changed details or emphasized different values. Their flood myths resembled Sumerian ones, but featured different heroes and different relationships with the gods. These variations sparked debates about which versions held true authority and whether traditional Sumerian wisdom still applied in this changing world. As decades passed, it became clear that something fundamental had shifted in Mesopotamian civilization. Writing was no longer exclusively Sumerian property. The technology had grown beyond its creators, becoming a tool that any ambitious people could master and adapt. This transformation would soon produce consequences that neither Sumerians nor Akkadians fully anticipated, setting the stage for dramatic changes in how power itself was organized and exercised across the ancient world. Chapter 4: Triumphs and Turmoil, the Age of Sumerian City-States. Part 1: Kings of Conflict, from Gilgamesh to Enma-Bar-Aghesi. The dusty streets of ancient Uruk echoed with the footsteps of its most famous ruler, a man whose name would survive thousands of years. Gilgamesh strode through his city like a force of nature, his ambition burning as bright as the temple fires that lit the night sky. He was no ordinary king. Stories tell of his incredible strength and his endless hunger for glory that drove him to build walls so massive they seemed to touch the heavens themselves. But Gilgamesh faced a problem that would shape the future of all Mesopotamia. To the north, in the powerful city of Kish, another ambitious ruler was making his own mark on history. Enma-Bar-Aghesi ruled with an iron fist, and unlike the legendary Gilgamesh, we know he was absolutely real. Clay tablets bearing his name prove that this king of Kish conquered lands far beyond his city walls and built temples that amazed all who saw them. These two rulers represented something new in human civilization. They weren't just tribal chiefs or village elders. They were kings who dreamed of empire, men who saw their cities as centers of the world and themselves as chosen by the gods to rule. Their rivalry sparked something remarkable across Sumer. Each king tried to outdo the other. When Gilgamesh built his famous walls around Uruk, other cities followed suit. When Enma-Bar-Aghesi conquered distant Elam and brought back precious stones and metals, rival kings launched their own military campaigns. This competition pushed Sumerian society forward in ways no one could have predicted. The constant struggle for supremacy forced these city-states to organize like never before. Kings needed loyal administrators to collect taxes and manage their growing territories. They required skilled craftsmen to build monuments that would impress their rivals. Most importantly, they needed a way to record their achievements for all time. This need gave birth to something revolutionary. Scribes began carving the deeds of their kings into clay tablets, creating the first historical records in human history. They wrote about victories in battle, the construction of great buildings, and the wisdom of their rulers. These weren't just government documents. They were the foundation of written literature itself. The personal ambitions of men like Gilgamesh and Enma-Bar-Aghesi transformed scattered farming communities into true urban centers. Their quest for immortal fame created the world's first organized states, complete with laws, armies, and bureaucracies. Their rivalry didn't just shape their own cities. It sparked a chain reaction that spread across all of Mesopotamia. As these powerful kings consolidated their control and expanded their influence, they unknowingly set the stage for even greater conflicts. Their success in building centralized states and their constant warfare with neighboring cities would soon attract the attention of new enemies from beyond Sumer's borders, forcing these proud city-states to face their greatest challenge yet. Part 2. Walls and Warfare, Defensive Genius and Urban Rivalry. The king's ambitions had awakened something dangerous. As Uruk, Kish, and other city-states grew wealthy and powerful, they became tempting targets. Raiders from the eastern mountains watched these prosperous settlements with hungry eyes. Rival cities plotted against their neighbors. The age of simple farming villages was over, and with it came the harsh reality that success bred enemies. The first walls rose around Uruk, sometime after 3000 BCE. These weren't simple barriers, but massive engineering projects that stretched for miles. Workers hauled countless mud bricks under the burning sun, stacking them into walls 20 feet high and 12 feet thick. Gates made of precious cedar wood, reinforced with bronze, controlled who entered and left. Watchtowers dotted the perimeter, giving guards clear views of approaching threats across the flat plains. Other cities quickly followed. Kish built walls to match Uruk's grandeur. Ur constructed defenses that protected both the city and its vital harbor. Each construction project took years and demanded enormous resources. Citizens paid higher taxes. Farmers spent months away from their fields, working as laborers. The walls represented both protection and sacrifice. Inside these fortified cities, warfare transformed from chaotic raids into organized science. Smiths worked bronze into stronger spear points and sharper sword blades. They crafted helmets that could deflect enemy blows and shields light enough for soldiers to carry all day. The wealthy elite commissioned elaborate weapons decorated with gold and silver, symbols of their status as warrior leaders. Military organization became more sophisticated. Kings created permanent armies instead of relying on farmers who fought part-time. Professional soldiers trained constantly, learning formations and tactics. They marched in neat rows, shields locked together, spear points gleaming in the desert sun. Archers practiced until they could hit targets at remarkable distances. These weren't random fighters, but disciplined forces that could execute complex battle plans. The political landscape shifted like sand in a windstorm. Cities that had once traded peacefully now viewed each other with suspicion. Temporary alliances formed when external threats appeared, only to crumble when those dangers passed. Kish might ally with Uruk against raiders from Elam, then attack Uruk 6 months later over water rights or trade disputes. This constant state of potential warfare reshaped society itself. Merchants traveled in armed caravans. Farmers built their homes closer to city walls. Children grew up hearing stories of heroes and battles instead of simple folk tales. The peaceful world of early Sumer was disappearing, replaced by a harder civilization where strength mattered as much as wisdom. The walls stood as monuments to this transformation. They protected the city's wealth and people, but they also symbolized the fear that now governed daily life. Behind these massive barriers, Sumerian civilization flourished and grew more complex. Yet the very success that built these walls also attracted the attention of more powerful enemies from distant lands, setting the stage for conflicts that would test these defenses to their limits. Part 3. Sumer versus Elam, the first recorded wars. Beyond their familiar walls, the Sumerians faced a different kind of enemy. While city-states had battled each other for generations, these conflicts remained family disputes between people who shared the same gods and customs. But across the Zagros Mountains to the east lived the Elamites, a foreign people with their own language, traditions, and ambitions. The first clash came when Elamite raiders began attacking Sumerian trading caravans traveling through mountain passes. These weren't random bandits, but organized forces from established Elamite cities like Susa and Anshan. Sumerian merchants complained bitterly to their kings about lost goods and murdered guards. The mountain routes carried precious metals, stones, and timber that Sumer desperately needed, making these attacks more than simple theft. King Enmabaragesi of Kish decided to act. Around 2700 BCE, he gathered warriors from multiple Sumerian cities for something unprecedented, a war against foreigners. The cuneiform tablets from this period record the excitement and fear in equal measure. Scribes wrote about armies marching toward mountains they had never seen, following their king into lands where people spoke in strange tongues. The campaign proved harder than anyone expected. Elamite fighters knew their mountainous terrain perfectly, disappearing into rocky gorges when Sumerian forces approached, then striking from hidden positions. The Sumerians, used to fighting on flat plains between cities, struggled with this new type of warfare. Many soldiers fell to arrows shot from cliff faces they couldn't see. Yet Enmebaragesi's forces eventually reached Elam itself. The king's scribes recorded the capture of several Elamite settlements and the taking of prisoners. More importantly, they established Sumerian control over key mountain passes, securing the trade routes that had sparked the conflict. Victory tablets proclaimed Enmebaragesi as the first king to defeat foreign enemies, a title that elevated him above other Sumerian rulers. But the Elamites learned from their defeat. Within decades, they organized their own revenge campaigns, sweeping down from the mountains to attack Sumerian border cities. These wars created a cycle of raid and counter-raid that would continue for centuries, each side growing stronger and more organized through constant conflict. Something remarkable happened during these struggles. Sumerian cities that had spent generations fighting each other began cooperating against the foreign threat. Uruk sent soldiers to help defend when Elamites approached. Priests from different cities performed joint ceremonies asking the gods for victory over the mountain people. For the first time, being Sumerian meant something more than loyalty to a single city. The war stories spread throughout Sumer, told and retold until they became legends. Scribes recorded not just military victories, but tales of heroes who fought monsters in distant lands. These stories helped create a shared Sumerian identity, defining who they were by showing who they were not. The conflicts with Elam had given birth to something new, a people united not just by rivers and trade, but by the memory of facing danger together. Part 4. The Akkadian Upsurge. Sumer's Culture Under New Rule. The wars with Elam had forged something powerful among the scattered city-states, but this unity would soon face its greatest test. Far to the north, beyond the familiar borders of Sumer, a man named Sargon was building an empire that would change everything. Unlike the Sumerian kings who ruled single cities, Sargon commanded the loyalty of an entire people called the Akkadians. These were Semitic-speaking warriors who had lived alongside the Sumerians for generations, learning their ways while maintaining their own fierce traditions. Sargon's armies swept down from the north around 2334 BCE like a storm across the plains. One by one, the great Sumerian cities fell to his bronze weapons and disciplined troops. Uruk, the birthplace of Gilgamesh's legends, opened its gates. With its towering ziggurats, submitted to Akkadian rule. Even proud Lagash, which had fought so valiantly against Elam, bowed before Sargon's might. The age of independent Sumerian city-states had ended. Yet something remarkable happened under Akkadian rule. Rather than crushing Sumerian culture, Sargon chose to embrace it. He understood that the Sumerians possessed something his people lacked: thousands of years of knowledge about governing cities, managing complex irrigation systems, and recording information through writing. Akkadian nobles began learning cuneiform script, though they adapted it to write their own language. Sumerian scribes found themselves teaching Akkadian students, creating the world's first truly bilingual bureaucracy. The fusion went deeper than language. Akkadian soldiers married Sumerian women. Sumerian priests served Akkadian gods alongside their ancient deities. In the great temples, ceremonies blended traditions from both cultures, creating new rituals that satisfied everyone. Akkadian merchants adopted Sumerian business practices, while Sumerian craftsmen learned new techniques from their northern rulers. The result was neither purely Sumerian nor Akkadian, but something entirely new. Most importantly, cuneiform writing not only survived but flourished under Akkadian patronage. Sargon's administrators discovered that managing an empire required extensive record-keeping, making Sumerian scribal skills invaluable. These scribes began writing Akkadian words using Sumerian symbols, essentially creating the world's first translation system. They recorded laws in both languages, kept tax records in cuneiform, and even composed epic poems celebrating Akkadian victories using traditional Sumerian literary forms. Through this cultural blending, Sumerian identity transformed rather than disappeared. While they no longer ruled their own fate politically, Sumerians became the empire's intellectual backbone. Their schools trained the next generation of administrators. Their priests maintained religious traditions that gave legitimacy to Akkadian rule. Their writing system became the foundation for imperial communication across vast distances. The Akkadian conquest had created something unprecedented: a multicultural empire where the conquered became partners in governance rather than mere subjects, setting the stage for Sumerian culture's eventual renaissance. Part 5. Revival and Renaissance, the Third Dynasty of Ur. The collapse of Akkadian rule around 2150 BCE opened a window for Sumerian resurgence. As nomadic Gudians swept through Mesopotamia, destroying Akkadian cities and disrupting trade routes, the ancient Sumerian heartland lay in ruins. Yet from this chaos emerged an unexpected phoenix. The city of Ur, once a modest trading post, began gathering strength under local rulers who remembered the old ways. Ur-Nammu seized control around 2112 BCE, founding what historians call the Third Dynasty of Ur. Unlike previous conquerors who imposed foreign customs, Ur-Nammu deliberately revived Sumerian traditions. He spoke Sumerian in his court, restored ancient temples, and appointed Sumerian priests to positions of authority. This wasn't merely nostalgia. Ur-Nammu understood that Sumerian culture carried legitimacy that brute force alone could never achieve. The new dynasty transformed administration with systematic precision. Ur-Nammu created the world's first known law code, establishing consistent justice across his growing territory. These laws protected the weak, regulated commerce, and standardized punishments. Provincial governors received detailed instructions written in cuneiform, creating a bureaucratic network that stretched from the Persian Gulf to northern Mesopotamia. Every transaction, every legal dispute, every administrative decision was recorded and filed. Under Ur-Nammu's son Shulgi, this revival reached extraordinary heights. Shulgi ruled for 48 years, transforming Ur into Mesopotamia's dominant power. He standardized weights and measures, created a postal system connecting distant cities, and established schools that trained administrators in classical Sumerian literature. Trade flourished as merchants carried Sumerian goods across known world routes. The capital city itself became a wonder. Massive ziggurats rose toward the heavens, their brick faces gleaming with glazed tiles. The Great Ziggurat of Ur, still standing today, symbolized this renaissance. Craftsmen produced intricate jewelry, musicians composed hymns praising Sumerian gods, and scribes copied ancient texts while creating new works of literature. This period saw remarkable innovations in urban planning. Cities were rebuilt with straight streets, proper drainage systems, and designated commercial districts. Harbors were expanded to accommodate larger ships. Granaries stored surplus crops against future famines. The state maintained detailed records of everything from livestock counts to textile production. Yet this golden age carried the seeds of its own destruction. The extensive bureaucracy required enormous resources to maintain. Heavy taxation to fund monumental building projects and military campaigns gradually weakened the economic foundation. Provincial governors accumulated personal power, challenging central authority. External pressures from Amorite tribes and Elamite kingdoms intensified. By 2000 BCE, cracks appeared in Ur's empire. Rebellions erupted in distant provinces. Trade routes became unsafe as bandits proliferated. The last king of Ur, Ibbi-Sin, watched helplessly as his realm crumbled. Elamite armies finally captured Ur itself in 2004 BCE, ending the Third Dynasty and Sumer's final moment of independence. This renaissance had lasted barely 2 centuries, but its impact endured. The legal codes, administrative practices, and cultural achievements of the Third Dynasty influenced every subsequent Mesopotamian civilization. Sumerian had enjoyed one last brilliant flowering before fading into the broader tapestry of ancient Near Eastern history. Chapter 5: Shifting Sands, the Legacy and Aftermath. Part 1: Decline and Fall, Invasions, Environmental Change, and the End of Sumer. By 2000 BCE, the great Sumerian cities that had dominated the land between the rivers for over 1,000 years began to crumble under mounting pressures. The troubles came from all directions at once, like a perfect storm of disasters that would ultimately end one of humanity's first great civilizations. The earth itself seemed to turn against the Sumerians. Year after year, their irrigation canals carried salt from deeper soil layers up to the surface. This salt buildup, called salinization, slowly poisoned the fertile black earth that had made their cities possible. Farmers watched helplessly as their barley crops withered and died. What had once been the world's most productive farmland became increasingly barren. The same irrigation system that had built their civilization was now destroying it. Drought made everything worse. The Euphrates and Tigris rivers, normally reliable sources of water, began to run lower. Canal systems that depended on steady river flow started failing. Cities that had grown large and wealthy suddenly found themselves struggling to feed their people. Once home to hundreds of thousands, saw its population shrink as families left to find better farmland elsewhere. Internal fighting weakened the city-states just when they needed unity most. Uruk fought with Lagash, Nippur competed with Babylon for control of trade routes. Kings spent their treasuries on wars instead of maintaining the complex irrigation networks their cities desperately needed. The constant warfare exhausted resources and divided attention from the growing environmental crisis. Then came the invasions. The Elamites from the east had watched Sumerian weakness with growing interest. They swept down from the Zagros Mountains in wave after wave of attacks. Their armies captured around 2004 BCE, dragging its last king away in chains. The Amorites, nomadic peoples from the western deserts, pressed in from another direction. Unlike previous invaders who had adopted Sumerian ways, these new groups brought their own cultures and languages. The old system of independent city-states could not survive this combination of disasters. One by one, the great centers of Sumerian civilization fell under foreign control or were simply abandoned. Survivors scattered across Mesopotamia, carrying their knowledge and skills to new masters. The cuneiform writing system they had invented spread far beyond Sumer's borders, but it now served Akkadian and Babylonian rulers rather than Sumerian kings. By 1750 BCE, Sumerian had ceased to be a spoken language. Their cities lay buried under sand and silt, yet their greatest invention, writing itself, lived on. The script they had created to record temple offerings and royal decrees would survive for thousands more years, carrying forward the seeds of civilization even as the civilization that created it faded into memory. Part 2. Writing Beyond Sumer. The Spread Across the Ancient World. The Sumerian writing system refused to die with its creators. Like seeds carried on desert winds, cuneiform script spread across the ancient world, taking root in languages and cultures far from its birthplace between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. What had begun as simple marks pressed into clay tablets to count sheep and barley would transform how entire civilizations conducted business, waged war, and preserved their memories. The Akkadians were among the first to recognize the power of this invention. When they conquered Sumerian cities around 2300 BCE, they didn't destroy the writing system, they adopted it. Akkadian scribes took the wedge-shaped marks and bent them to fit their own Semitic language. They kept the basic symbols but gave them new sounds and meanings. A sign that meant water in Sumerian could now represent a syllable in Akkadian. This flexibility made cuneiform incredibly adaptable. Word of this revolutionary technology spread like wildfire across trade routes. Merchants carrying goods from Mesopotamia also carried knowledge of writing. Kings who received cuneiform tablets from their neighbors quickly realized they needed their own scribes to respond. Within centuries, the script had reached the mountains of Anatolia, where the Hittites adapted it for their Indo-European language, and the highlands of Iran, where the Elamites made it serve their own tongue. Each culture that embraced cuneiform transformed it to meet their needs. The Babylonians used it to record their epic literature, creating masterpieces like the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Assyrians employed it for their military campaigns, keeping detailed records of conquered territories and tribute payments. Royal libraries filled with thousands of clay tablets, creating the world's first organized knowledge repositories. The technology of writing revolutionized diplomacy. Kings could now send detailed messages across vast distances without relying on human memory. Treaties were carved in stone, making agreements permanent and verifiable. The famous Code of Hammurabi, inscribed in cuneiform around 1750 BCE, showed how writing could preserve laws for future generations. But cuneiform did more than preserve information. It created it. Scholars began writing down mathematical calculations, astronomical observations, and medical treatments. Knowledge that had once lived only in the minds of specialists could now be studied, copied, and improved upon. Schools emerged to train scribes, creating an educated class that transcended ethnic boundaries. For over 3,000 years, cuneiform remained the diplomatic language of the ancient Near East. Even after the fall of Babylon, Persian emperors continued using it for official inscriptions. The script outlived the civilization that created it by millennia, carrying forward Sumerian innovations in law, literature, and learning. When cuneiform finally faded from use, it left behind thousands of clay tablets buried in ancient ruins. These silent witnesses would wait patiently in the earth, preserving the voices of the past until modern archaeologists could give them new life. Part 3. The Sumerian Afterimage, Influences on Law, Literature, and Religion. When the dust settled over the ruins of Sumerian cities, something remarkable happened. The ideas, stories, and ways of organizing life that Sumerians had created did not die with their civilization. Instead, these cultural seeds scattered across the ancient world, taking root in new societies that would reshape them into their own unique forms. The Babylonians became the most direct inheritors of Sumerian wisdom. When King Hammurabi carved his famous law code around 1750 BCE, he was building upon legal traditions the Sumerians had established centuries earlier. The concept of written law itself came from Sumer, where rulers like Ur-Nammu had first put justice into permanent form. Hammurabi's code borrowed specific ideas about property rights, marriage contracts, and punishment for crimes. Even the dramatic prologue, where the king claims divine authority to make laws, echoed Sumerian royal traditions. Religious practices showed even deeper connections. Babylonian temples continued using Sumerian hymns and rituals, often keeping the original Sumerian language for sacred purposes. The great creation epic, the Enuma Elish, retold older Sumerian stories about gods shaping the world from primordial waters. Marduk, the Babylonian supreme deity, inherited many characteristics from the Sumerian god Enlil. Temple architecture followed Sumerian patterns, with towering ziggurats dominating city skylines across Mesopotamia. Literature carried forward Sumerian narrative techniques and themes. The Epic of Gilgamesh, though written in Akkadian, grew from earlier Sumerian tales about the legendary king of Uruk. Babylonian poets expanded these stories but kept the essential structure of heroic adventure, friendship, and the search for immortality. Scribal schools throughout the region continued teaching Sumerian literary classics alongside newer works, ensuring these ancient stories survived in memory and manuscript. Administrative practices proved equally persistent. The Assyrians and later the Persians adopted Sumerian methods for organizing provinces, collecting taxes, and maintaining records. The idea of professional bureaucracy, with trained scribes managing complex governmental systems, became standard across successive empires. Even accounting methods and mathematical concepts originated in Sumerian temples and markets continued serving new rulers. These influences moved beyond Mesopotamia itself. When Hittite kings in distant Anatolia needed to record treaties, they used cuneiform script and borrowed Sumerian diplomatic formulas. Egyptian scribes, though they developed their own hieroglyphic system, adopted Mesopotamian techniques for organizing archives and conducting international correspondence. What made this cultural transmission so powerful was how each new civilization adapted, rather than simply copied Sumerian innovations. They took the fundamental concepts but expressed them in their own languages, customs, and artistic styles. This process created a rich web of shared ideas across the ancient Near East, all traceable back to those first Sumerian experiments in city building, lawmaking, and storytelling. The Sumerian cultural foundation proved so solid that it supported civilizations for thousands of years. Even as political power shifted from one empire to another, these underlying patterns of thought and organization remained remarkably consistent. The ancient world had inherited a common vocabulary of civilization, written first in Sumerian clay. Part 4. The Rediscovery, Deciphering Cuneiform in the Modern Era. For nearly 3,000 years, The cuneiform tablets lay buried beneath desert sands, their wedge-shaped marks holding secrets that no living person could read. The ancient Sumerian civilization had vanished so completely that even its existence was forgotten. Then, in the 1800s, European explorers began finding strange clay tablets covered with mysterious symbols that looked like tiny nail marks pressed into the clay. The breakthrough came through pure determination and a stroke of luck. Henry Rawlinson, a British officer stationed in Persia, discovered a massive inscription carved high on a cliff face at Behistun. The inscription told the same story in 3 different scripts: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian cuneiform. Rawlinson risked his life dangling from ropes hundreds of feet above the ground to copy every mark. This became the Rosetta Stone of cuneiform writing. Working backwards from languages they partially understood, scholars began to crack the code. They started with Babylonian, which used cuneiform symbols to write a Semitic language. Each small victory led to another puzzle piece falling into place. The symbols that looked like pictures weren't always pictures at all. Sometimes they represented sounds, sometimes whole words, sometimes just parts of words. The real surprise came when archaeologists began digging at ancient Mesopotamian sites. At Leonard Woolley found royal tombs filled with golden treasures and evidence of elaborate burial ceremonies. At Nippur, thousands of tablets revealed an entire library of ancient literature. But the biggest shock was discovering that beneath the Babylonian layers lay something even older. Tablets written in a completely different language that no one had ever heard of. This mystery language turned out to be Sumerian. Unlike Babylonian, which belonged to a family of languages scholars recognized, Sumerian stood alone. It had no known relatives. Deciphering it required starting from scratch, using bilingual texts where Babylonian scribes had translated Sumerian works for their own students. Each discovery painted a clearer picture of a lost world. The tablets weren't just official records or religious texts. They contained shopping lists, love letters, student homework, and legal complaints. One tablet recorded a student's excuse note to his teacher. Another contained the world's first known recipe. These everyday documents brought the Sumerians back to life as real people with familiar concerns. The excavations revealed entire cities frozen in time. Archaeologists found the remains of ziggurats, workshops, homes, and streets. They could trace how cuneiform evolved from simple picture writing to a sophisticated system capable of recording any thought or sound. The Sumerians had created more than just writing. They had invented the very idea of preserving human knowledge for future generations. This rediscovery transformed our understanding of human history. Suddenly, civilization appeared to be much older and more complex than anyone had imagined. The modern world could finally appreciate its debt to those ancient innovators who first pressed marks into clay tablets beside the rivers of Mesopotamia. Part 5. Echoes in Eternity, Sumer's Gift to Civilization. This rediscovery marked just the beginning of understanding what the Sumerians had truly given the world. When those first cuneiform tablets were translated, scholars realized they were holding something revolutionary in their hands. The Sumerians had not just invented a way to write, they had created the foundation for everything we now call civilization. Before writing existed, human knowledge lived only in memory. When an elder died, their wisdom died with them. Stories changed with each telling. Laws existed only as long as people remembered them. The Sumerians changed this forever. They created a way to capture thoughts and preserve them across time. Their clay tablets became the world's first libraries, courts, and schools. A farmer could record his harvest. A merchant could track his trades. A king could preserve his laws for future generations. For the first time in human history, knowledge could outlive the person who created it. This gift spread like ripples across water. The Akkadians took cuneiform and adapted it for their language. The Babylonians used it to create the first written law code. The Assyrians built vast libraries filled with tablets. Each civilization that received this gift transformed it and passed it forward. Writing became the thread that connected all human progress. It allowed science to build upon previous discoveries rather than starting fresh each generation. Literature could preserve the greatest stories and poems. History could be recorded rather than lost. Complex governments could function across vast distances through written orders and records. Consider what would have been impossible without this Sumerian innovation. The great libraries of Alexandria could never have existed. The religious texts that guide billions today could not have been preserved. Scientific knowledge would have remained trapped in individual minds. Legal systems could never have developed beyond simple tribal customs. The impact continues today. Every book, every email, every text message traces its roots back to those first marks pressed into clay beside ancient rivers. The internet itself is simply the latest evolution of the Sumerian idea that information should be recorded and shared. Even our modern challenges reflect Sumerian solutions. When we worry about preserving knowledge for future generations, we echo their concern. When we create databases and digital archives, we follow their example. When we write laws and constitutions, we use tools they invented. The Sumerians understood something profound about human nature. They recognized that individual genius means nothing if it cannot be passed on. They saw that civilization requires continuity, and continuity requires recording. Their clay tablets became humanity's first step toward conquering time itself. Their gift continues to shape our world in ways they could never have imagined, proving that some innovations are so fundamental they become invisible threads woven into the fabric of human existence.